Okay, hey, wow, great energy in the room, and I want to wish you a good evening, one and all, and welcome to Loyola University of Chicago here on the banks of the Michigan River, or Lake of the Michigan River, the banks of the Michigan River. We're gambling rings free.
Different kind of.
But you know, it really is. It's a majestic Lake Michigan, and it's a special place to be, Loyola here. A special place for teaching, learning, dialogue, prayer, and service. And happy to be here tonight for an example of that. My name is Michael Murphy, and I direct the Hank Center here at Loyola. And on behalf of our Cracker Jack Hank Center staff, Katie Arnold, who's our that's the board member, by the way. Thank you, Katie Arnold is our center manager. Our intrepid undergraduate team is Grace, Connor, Mary, and Grace. We have two Graces in our and so we got to have a lot of grace at the Hank Center. And on behalf of Joan and Bill Hank, whose generous endowment fires our many endeavors, we welcome you here to our annual Terre de Chardin SJ Following Catholic Studies lecture, the subject of public religion, featuring Father Paddy Gilger, the Society of Jesus, and who is a PhD as well. He's an assistant professor of sociology here at Loyola. Such a delight to be in person. I mean, we are back from COVID, but this energy in the room, there's nothing like it. So I'm just glad to see you. And it's great to see a great cross section of people. You got students, faculty, staff, friends from the Jesuit community, friends from the neighborhood. We welcome so many friends all, and all are welcome. We've not left Zoom behind though, and we welcome hundreds of registrations for this talk. So that's a great hybrid thing for us. And so you on the live stream, welcome to our midst, my friends. We thank our engineer, Sam Source, over here, and Adam High, our graduate assistants helping, and the Loyola IT team for making this possible. So again, welcome one and all. A lot of welcoming and hospitality that was where it's at, especially here at Loyola. And so in that spirit, let's welcome Dr. Peter Schrader, the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, to provide his own Dean's welcome. Dr. Schrader, please. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Mike. And I promise to be brief. I mean, just wanted to say hi to everybody and thank you for joining us this evening. I mean, for me personally, as a faculty member of more than 30 years and as Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, this annual lecture series is important to me at so many different levels. I think first and foremost, I mean, it really enables us to celebrate and highlight the amazing work that is being done by the Hank Center for the Catholic Intellectual Heritage. And we have 7 centers in the college, but I think this is the center that really shows us how it should be done academically and what should be the focal points of our research and work. And I think that this is in no small part due to our executive director, Mike Murphy, and his staff. And his staff led by Katie Arnold, who deserves another round of applause, wherever Katie is. And then second of all, I love this series because, you know, it enables us to honor and remember the namesake of this series, which is the French Jesuit priest, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. And for me, especially as a French speaker, I love the fact that we do this for the simple fact, that both Teilhard de Chardin and I both attended the same university in Paris, which is the Catholic Institute of Paris. Wow. But he obviously attended it a little earlier than I did. But you know, he was a fascinating character. I mean, during World War I, he served with the Moroccan Rifles. I mean, he was an incredible world traveler. He traveled around Europe, China, Asia, and the United States. And he was also a very imaginative thinker. So the work that I especially appreciate is where he would combine his interests in paleontology, evolutionary theory, and Catholicism, which was no easy feat. And then he was also sometimes a little controversial, but we're here to celebrate the positive things that he did. And then finally, I also love this lecture because, it enables us to celebrate the work of an important scholar within the discipline and the research that that scholar is doing. And this evening, we have the pleasure of having Professor Paddy Gilger, who is a rock star assistant professor in the Department of Sociology here at Loyola University, Chicago. And the topic of his presentation could not be more timely because he's looking at the relationship between religion, democracy, politics, and the public sphere. So what could be controversial about that, right? So, and a little known fact, there are 47 predominantly Catholic countries within the world. So it's about a quarter of all countries within the world, meaning their population is more than 50% Catholic or self-ascribed Catholics. And about half of those countries are democracies. So it's like the perfect laboratory for the work that Professor Gilger is working on. So without any further ado, thank you all for joining us this evening. There's a lot of things that you can be doing on a Thursday night, so we're thrilled that you're here with us at Loyola University of Chicago. And having said that, why don't I turn it back over to Mike, who can introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Thank you very much, and I'll be brief, but we just two Teilhard insights just to build on Dr. Schrader. By virtue of creation, says Teilhard, and still more the incarnation, nothing here below is profane for those who know how to see. Indeed, the whole life lies in the verb seeing. And then this one here I like, especially for you scholars, research is the highest form of adoration. A little loaded. But Teilhard was naturally profoundly engaged in these questions, at all questions at his disposal, because he was a Jesuit mystic scientist. That's not a title you hear too much of. The Hank Center tries to be as interdisciplinary as Teilhard and people like him. And it's very important that we do. If you think about it, Paddy is a sociologist. Dr. Kathy Cummings last year is a historian. Dr. Steve Millies is here, our Teilhard fellow from 2 years ago, is a political scientist. We've had environmental science, we've had theology, novelists, and directors of theater arts. Celebrating the many ways to know. So I just want to make sure to encourage that all knowledge is interconnected, or as St. John Henry Newman might say, all knowledge forms one whole because its subject matter is one. I say amen to that. A brief note about our speaker, our lecturer, our fellow, Father Gilger. Paddy Gilger is a priest of the Midwest Province of Society of Jesus, a graduate of Creighton University, the Jesuit School of Theology in California, and the New School where Paddy earned his doctorate. He's been a Jesuit since 2002. Trained in philosophy and theology, in addition to sociology, he now primarily studies social theory, the sociology of religion and secularity. His current research focuses on how communities of practice cultivate religious subjectivities that are difficult to see and hear in a secular age, and how these unique subjectivities cultivate particular, quote, powers of publicity that can be deployed within an always already power-inflected public sphere. Whew. I feel that energy and I'm ready for this one, my friend. This lecture will be about 45 minutes or so, and after that we'll have 20 or 25 minutes of comment Q&A, so please prepare. Again, Zoom folks, please integrate the way you usually do with a message to Adam hi, and thank you. So without further ado, and it's been a lot, let's welcome our 2023 Teilhard fellow, Father Paddy Gilger.
Great late, man. I love you. Love you too. Thank you all for being here. Can you hear me okay? Should I do a little more? Is this working? No? Okay. What if oh yeah. I'll start singing in a moment. Thank you all for being here. I feel very honored. And for the most of the last, 30 hours, I felt exceptionally nervous as well. So it's been a pleasure to finally be up here and to be speaking with you all, to be sharing a few things. A few word of thanks from myself at the beginning. First, thanks to the Hank Center. Mike, thank you for your words. Joe, thank you for your support. Katie, Connor, Mary, Grace, you guys have done wonderful work. Thank you. To the Loyola community, my sociology department, my colleagues and students in the sociology department, Peter, Christian, all of you here, thank you. Elfrida, I'm sure I'm missing others. Thank you for this. And all of those who are in mission and identity, campus ministry, my friends in the philosophy department, Dean Schrader, President Reed, who I am told is joining us online. I apologize for everything in advance, Dr. Reed. To the many guests who've also traveled here, thank you for being here. Adam, Joshua, Jamie, thank you very much for your presence, your time, and those who are online, my family and my friends, my sisters, Dana and Lauren, and my parents. I love them very much. Especially also want to say thank you to the Jesuit community here. I'm very grateful to you all. Father Salmi, our rector, thank you for your support, and all those with whom I live and have lived, those I've been a student of and a teacher for. I'm really honored to be a part of the Long Black Line. I also want to say a thank you to Father Tom Lawler, who was the one who missioned me to doctoral studies against my will. I questioned when he did that whether he might be making a mistake, and he very gently said, Paddy, you've been asking the Society of Jesus to tell you what to do since you were 21. I'm asking. I'm here and grateful to be here. He called me to fulfill the vow of obedience I made as a young man to God in a way that I was not sure I was capable of fulfilling. That's the truth. And being stretched in this way by him and by this process of study has been a great gift of facing and embracing insufficiency, my own. And the scholarship that I present to you tonight is the fruit of that insufficiency. That's what it is. And so lastly, I want to say thank you to God. Thank you. To whom I have been taught to listen. This is, after all, obedience. That's all it is in the end, listening. We begin with a poem then. This is the poem that's on your sheets. It's Compline by Philip Metras. Philip Metras teaches, as many of you will know, at John Carroll University. He's both professor of English there and director of Peace, Justice, and Human Rights program. The name of the poem is Compline. It's from a decade ago. As many of you know, Compline is the name for night prayer, the final prayer of the Liturgy of the Hours that many Catholics say. It is night, and we are praying, but we begin with it rather than end this evening. Compline. That we await a blessed hope, and that we will be struck with great fear, like a baby taken into the night, that every boot, every improvised explosive, Talon and Hornet, Molotov and rubber-coated bullet, every unexploded cluster bomb, bomblet, every Kevlar and suicide vest and unpiloted drone raining fire on wedding parties will be burned as fuel in the dark season. That we will learn the awful hunger of God, the nerve-fraying cry of God, the curdy vomit of God, the soiled swaddle of God, the constant wakefulness of God, alongside the sweet scalp of God, the contented murmur of God, the limb-twitched dream reaching of God. We're dizzy in every departure, limb lost. We cannot sleep in the wake of God, and God will not sleep, the infant dream for long. We lift the blinds, look out into ink for light. My God, open the spine binding our sight. Open the spine binding our sight. In the Ignatian tradition, there is a method of exercises for aiding in just such opening. It's called the meditation on the incarnation. And in it, the one praying is asked to imagine themselves seated with the triune God, gazing down upon the world, looking at all it is, at reality. What does the Creator see when gazing with love upon his own creation? Ignatius asks. Recently, the Jesuit Spiritual Superior General, Arturo Sosa, has asked us to pose this together, this same question once more. So Jesuits and our collaborators, what do we see when we gaze upon the world now? In the text with which he promulgated this question, it is unflinching. The text is unflinching in its description of the world, of the reality upon which we gaze. Millions in forced migration, melting ice caps, the widening gyre of economic and social and gendered and health inequities, and then the multiple forces of de-democratization, populism, polarization, our steady drift towards a tribalized post-truth world. As my grandfather used to say to his daughter, my mother, Kristen, you have your facts and I have mine. Now we are all my grandfather. We see this all over the country and the world, not just in the difficulty that we have in crafting legislation or electing a Speaker of the House, but even in our laughably common inability to listen to or to speak with those who disagree with us or push upon us. It's difficult on college campuses and at public events and the pages that held our old media together and on the phones that hold our new media for us to imagine coming together in our differences to argue about what the common good might even be, common or good. What is this that seems to have slipped away from us? What role did it play in our democracy? Can it be reconstituted, recaptured? What role might religious persons and institutions have to play in such an ambitious and overwhelming project? These are the questions that I want to think with us about a little bit this evening. I offer it as a small response in a different idiom to Metris's poem, a small effort to help us to open the spine. Here's what I will argue. Although there are many facets, to the crisis of de-democratization, one of the most pressing, because it inhibits our capacity to imagine and to enact shared responses, is the collapse of the public sphere, that institutional and ethical space in which we can appear before one another, speak with one another about our differences and about our hopes, and attempt once more to pursue the common good. The good news, I give it to you now, is that in speaking as a sociologist, I am confident there are ways we can respond to this crisis. It is not impossible. There are ways, in fact, that public religion of many kinds can help in reconstructing a plural public sphere, and in so doing, help stem the tide of de-democratization, anti-politics, demagoguery, autocracy. But I give you two caveats, that one practical and one theoretical. The practical caveat is this. Although what I will share with you is real, I will attempt to show you something of the sociological research I've been doing over the last half decade or so. It is not a silver bullet. In other words, it's not just theory. We will do some of that because I'm from the new school, and when you can do theory, why do data? You know, that's what we would say. But this is still true. It's real, but it's not a silver bullet. Instead, what I think my research actually shows is that if we want to practice democracy, it is we who are ourselves who must become capable of practicing it again. Yes, we need institutions, but it's not just the institutions, it's fundamentally us who must change. It's who we are willing to become that determines what we will be capable of giving. Here is the theoretical caveat. To understand the depths of this change, I will have to ask you to stick with me as we follow together what the great French philosopher Paul Ricoeur used to call the long route. We have to do some of the intellectual and social theory in order to help us understand the meaning of the evidence that I'll put before us later this evening. So here's how that long route is going to look. To understand the crisis of the public sphere, we have to understand what the public is, and then what a public religion is. To do that, we have to understand something of how what we call the public came to be in the first place, how it was born with these radical changes in institutional condition and ways of living that we call modernity. Taking this step back, looking at creation, not only in the snapshot of the present moment, in other words, but as it has grown over the centuries, will allow us not to understand not just the subject of public religion, but the subjects, the persons who come to the public bearing potential gifts. So the double entendre embedded in my title is that in order for us to understand the subject of public religion, we must understand the subject of public religion. It's persons to whom we have to attend. So what is modernity? A very dangerous question. Proceeding with the caveat, please forgive the sin of speed that I will commit presently. I think it's fair to say that within sociology, modernity more or less means differentiation. What we mean by that as sociologists is that structurally, modernity is characterized by the splitting apart, the becoming autonomous of the various spheres of human life, human existence, politics, religion, art, economics. All of these things used to be linked together, and now they're split. We can understand this differentiation historically if we think of it through four revolutions, four overlapping changes that challenged and supported one another in their radical reformation of how we live communally and individually together today. We live in the wake of that. The wake is still carrying us forward. First, we see a political revolution, and then a scientific revolution, and then a corresponding industrial revolution, and then what we might call, with Immanuel Kant, a Copernican revolution, a turn to the self. A brief word about each to set this context for us. The first, political. From the Haitian Revolution to the French to the American, what we see in the turn to modernity is not just an overthrowing of the old powers, the ancient regime, but a splitting apart of the governing orders of the world, state from church, and eventually the private from the public. I will return to this split in just a second again here. The scientific and the corresponding industrial revolutions, the second and the third, these were the methods that allowed us a radically increased capacity of understanding and controlling the natural world and ourselves. The amount of control we have over ourselves now is just unimaginable without this kinds of revolutions. And of course, the same goes true for the natural world. More or less, the way we treat that world is the way we treat ourselves in terms of what is controllable or manipulable. Although these transitions take place over centuries, what we see here is how the scientific revolution, to some extent, demystifies the world and everything becomes comprehensible. Those of you who have read Weber will hear him write in this. But the technological forms and the means of production, the industrial revolution that goes along with this, as Marx would say, that are invented from these revolutions change radically the shape of work and the economy and our relations with one another. So we have these two and second and third revolutions. I will save the fourth for a moment in order to talk a bit about what the public sphere is and how it fits in with those first three revolutions, those changes that have happened. For Habermas, maybe the most famous theorist of the public sphere, although I beg forgiveness from John Dewey and Hannah Arendt, our secular saints in heaven. And the public space for Habermas was the space in which diverse persons, different people, could rationally debate about the good of society at large. It was separate, distinct from the powers of the state, the rulers. And it was one of the mechanisms, maybe the prime mechanism, through which citizens could effect change in their own social and political and personal context. So in his famous structural transformation of the public sphere, Habermas argues that something like an inclusive, rational, critical public sphere emerged in the 18th century in different ways in France and in Germany and in England. He makes these interesting comparisons about the places where it happened and how it does and what it means. In each of these contexts, each of these places, Habermas notes, the public was rational. Arguments were made there, and they were not judged by who made them, but by how good they were. Amazing, that kind of equality that can emerge with that. And this meant that the public could be theoretically inclusive. Anybody who was capable of participating in this kind of rational argumentation, this reasoned debate, could enter and take part. Anybody could go to the coffee shop or to the salon if you could debate. The import of this space for inclusive, rational argument was that it formed a rational and inclusive political power. It changed the nature of political power for Habermas. The power of critical public opinion, formed by arguing together about the good of society, allowed people to think about how they might govern themselves. I quote Habermas, "The domination of the public, according to its own idea, was an order in which domination itself was dissolved." This is his great dream, even though I disagree with him on so many things. It's a beautiful dream. He's dreaming about the dissolving of unjust state power. He says it in the Latin, veritas non actoritas facit legem. The criticisms of the public sphere, though, emerge quickly afterwards. And they're right, because the boundaries of the public, both in practice and maybe even in ideal form, were only so permeable. There were exclusions of race and of class and of gender. And they were there. And another of the exclusions that gets talked about a little bit less, and this is not a competition, just to note it for tonight, is religion excluded from the public. This may seem surprising to us as Americans, where we live a version of secularism that separates church from state, but it allows religion to become public very easily. We ought to remember that for centuries, our modern political order sought to constrain religion to the private sphere. The logic went that if religion needed to be privatized in order to keep the irrational, even violent forces that it generates from disrupting the rational stability of a secular public. France lives in the era of this now, right? This is not the same, but this is the wake of that version of secularism. Religion, therefore, was irrational, and the irrational enthusiasms it generated needed to be kept out. So the first subject of public religion. Now we can see, with a little bit of this context of modernity, how deep the irony of even the phrase public religion is. Publicity and religion don't go together. You keep them apart. But Habermas, he seems to have wondered, how could this have ever happened? How could religion ever become public and participate in this kind of reasoned argumentation that might change the form of political power? That argument and the possibility for it was shown in Jose Casanova's classic 1994 text, Public Religions in the Modern World. What is a public religion then? For Casanova, public religion is an organization that refuses to be relegated to the private. We will not stay there, but instead seeks to enter civil society, doesn't try to reconquer the state, doesn't try to relink its particular denomination with the powers of the state, but instead enters the public sphere of civil society to debate about what is the common good for all of us. A public religion accepts political modernity while still seeking to make an impact in the differentiated spheres, the split world of our modern order. Casanova. Shorn of their role as grand legitimators, responsible for integrating and regulating the whole of society, religions can become movements and pressure groups that vie with rivals in the public sphere. This means for us that not every religion counts as a public religion, because not every religion knows how to or seeks to bring its concerns into the public without seeking to reclaim domination, without trying to reintegrate the divided spheres of church and state and the economy under its own control. This is part, in fact, of what we are seeing right now in the United States of America, with the rise of white Christian nationalism here in particular. For Casanova, this kind of religion is not a public religion, even though it is very public. But it's not because, or to the extent that, its members seek to reintegrate, to de-differentiate the divided spheres, to bring the church and state back into alignment, claiming we have always been like this. Whatever claim, not a public religion. Importantly, that there can even be such a thing as public religion might be obvious to us now, but when Casanova wrote this, it was not. In one of the book reviews that came out right afterwards, the reviewer found this argument so surprising that he felt like he needed to write his review just to show that public religions could possibly exist. He writes in there, I quote, "It might actually be the case that religions are not an unambiguous regression from modern norms, but that they might actually be able to find a home in a world which accepts the autonomy of politics, religious liberty, the integrity of individual consciences." In fairness, maybe I shouldn't be so hard on the reviewer, because it's not just him. It took the Catholic Church many centuries to come up with some kind of reconciliation for this. So it is not that he's guilty and I am not. In fact, it took all the way until Vatican II for the church to make its official peace with this new social and political arrangement. But even the Catholic Church, that most recalcitrant of institutions, has institutionally taken on the shape of a public religion. We're completely on board with this now. December of 1965 is the date when it happened. Paul VI promulgated Dignitatis Humanae, the Catholic Church's ratification of a personal right to religious freedom, to quote, immunity from coercion in civil society of all persons, not just Catholics. with the ratification of a personal right to religious freedom and civil society. In other words, Roman Catholicism voluntarily accepted institutional disestablishment and became a public religion. So the result of this, right? We can see it all over the place. The persons who have become famous in the wake of this, and they're not just Catholic, right? But we can see this. John Paul II, his worldwide fame, entrance into the civil sphere of public society, right? He's able to do this because the church has reconciled itself with being a public religion. Rowan Williams in the Anglican Church, Mother Teresa, the Dalai Lama, all of these people who seek to enter the public sphere to make a difference, to help us think about the common good. But it's not just persons, it's also, and very importantly, certain kinds of public action that become possible then. These days, in fact, Casanova has written this at another place. It seems often that when we need someone to remind us of the moral force of what we are supposed to be in modernity, we turn to a religious leader of different stripes. We're almost, agnostic about which religion, but we need someone to uphold it. Here are some examples, though. The Catholic Cardinal Peter Turkson, the Archbishop of Canterbury Rowan Williams, and Thabo Makopa, the Anglican Archbishop of Cape Town, along with the Dalai Lama, joined together during the COVID pandemic to call for an end to vaccine nationalism and health inequities. The Ecumenical World Council of Churches has released multiple statements, including one recently, to support the rights of refugees and migrants, mostly in Europe, but not only. The Grand Imam, Sheikh Abed al-Tayeb, with 40 other religious leaders from Sunni, Shia, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, Jainism, Sikhism, all gathered with Pope Francis before the COP26 2 years ago to pray and advocate for environmental justice. Indeed, it was announced yesterday that Pope Francis will address the gathered world leaders, the political leaders at COP28 in Dubai. He'll speak with them as they're having their debates. The document on human fraternity may actually be one of the most important examples of this. This was signed by Pope Francis and Ahmad al-Tayeb, the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar and the spiritual leader of some 1.3 billion Sunni Muslims in 2019. The leader of the Roman Catholic Church and the leader of Sunni Islam signing together a document on human fraternity. Amazing. All of these are examples of how religion has adapted itself to the conditions of modernity, to the differentiation produced by the first three revolutions. But this is a dilemma, there is a dilemma that can be missed when we only pay attention to these systems and to these institutions, to these policies. And to see that dilemma, we have to go back to the fourth revolution. You will remember the fourth revolution I called Copernican. Here we can see modernity not just as a set of institutional changes, but as a life world, a way of being human, a set of relationships that kind of get induced inside of us. This fourth revolution, the Copernican, we can call a turn to the subject. The subject becomes the center. The place of the person, rather than the community or the cosmos, occupies the center of reality. Amidst the many positive effects of this relocation of the self, the valorization of individual agency, the rediscovery of the inviolability of human conscience, a celebration of uniqueness, of individual preciousness of each person, come unique challenges as well. These can perhaps best be seen by having recourse to the term used by the great and soon-to-be doctor of the modern church of the Roman Catholic Church, Charles Taylor. His word for it is disembedding. I'm going to keep saying that until it happens. I'm speaking it into existence. Whereas we used to be constrained, disembedding, whereas we used to be constrained in the chain of being that ran vertically from God to queen to bishop to the parish priest to ourselves, we also used to be not just constrained, but also connected to one another through those links of the chain. But as the revolutions progress and differentiation continues, the sense of connection gets disrupted. It's radically altered, in fact. As Jamie Smith, who's joining us here, has put it in his own analysis of Taylor, these changes mean that, quote, we no longer feel that we fit into a cosmos as a cosmic home. Instead, we often feel adrift, cast into an anonymous and cold universe. What we see in this fourth revolution, the centering on the self rather than on nature or on God or on the cosmos, is that the differentiation of the spheres, it bleeds down into a lived sense that we ourselves have been differentiated. We've been disembedded from the nests and jutted out, broken apart from the chain of being. Casanova. Institutional segmentation, division, reproduces itself as segmentation within the individual's consciousness. What this means is that the differentiation that takes place in the world, the splitting of church and state and economy from the world of leisure, also happens in us. We come, in other words, to know how to move in different spaces that are governed by different logics, different ways of behaving, different ways of speaking, different patterns of interaction. Casanova again. If the temple of ancient polytheism was the pantheon, a place where all of the known and even the unknown gods could be worshipped simultaneously, the temple of modern pantheism is the mind of the individual self. Indeed, this experience depicts much of what Taylor describes not just as modernity, but secularity. Negotiating the differentiations, the cross pressures that result from these differentiations, is just what life is like for those of us who are secular moderns. We're just caught there. We don't live in Weber's iron cage anymore. We live in this one. Here's the good news. With that understanding of the four revolutions of modernity, how they give rise to the public sphere, how that both change the institutional location of religion, and how those revolutions change the kind of person, the subject, we might say, who fits inside of a differentiated modernity, we've done most of the hard theoretical and social historical work. So you made it, good work. The four revolutions produce two differentiations, institutional and individual, but there's still one question that arises again and again. It goes something like this. Can the differentiated, disembedded self sustain the commitments that are required to keep a differentiated political system going? A democracy? This is not a new question. It's an old one. As Alexis de Tocqueville noted in his famous Democracy in America, we Americans are possessed of, I quote, a reflexive and a peaceable sentiment that disposes each individual to isolate himself from the mass of those like him and withdraw to one side with his family and his friends, so that after having created a little society for his own use, he willingly abandons society at large to itself. Much later, Robert Bellah and his co-authors wrote in their famous Habits of the Heart that the question is whether an individualism in which the self has become the main form of reality can really be sustained. What's at issue is not simply whether self-contained individuals might withdraw from the public sphere to pursue purely private ends, but whether such individuals are actually capable of sustaining either a public or a private life. It's a devastating critique. Even the highly secular Jürgen Habermas, so suspicious of religion in his early life, has recently begun to turn to religious communities as potential sources of democratic stability and restabilization of the public sphere. Why? Why would even Habermas start looking to religion to do this? For similar reasons as Tocqueville and Bellah. Because for Habermas, secular reason, I quote him, fosters no impulse towards solidarity, that is, towards morally guided collective action. Secular morality is not inherently embedded in communal practices. Religious consciousness, by contrast, preserves an essential connection to the ongoing practice of life within a community. All of these thinkers are voicing a suspicion that democracy may require something more than what a differentiated and disembedded self is able to give. Note, I did not say willing, able. That what democracy may require is not differentiated, but integrated selves who value the modern separation of church and state, integrated citizens, I hasten to add, who are not political integralists. They're on the lookout for democratic reasons, in other words, for the topic of our lecture tonight, the subject of public religion. Catholic subjects of public religion. Just as the institutional transformation of Catholicism into public religion produced these kinds of external interventions that we talked about, so also it produced Catholics. This means, in other words, not just that the church out there as an institution, but the pilgrim people of God would take up the task of learning how to become persons capable of integrating themselves without integrating politics. Within the Catholic Church, one of the central sites where this project of internal formation of persons who were capable of acting as subjects of public religion happened were the newly founded ecclesial movements, most of these born right around Vatican II. There are many examples of them. Neo-Catechumenal Way, Opus Dei, the Catholic Worker, although that's earlier, L'Arche, Chemin Neuf, even Balthazar's short-lived Johannine community, which is lovely. But in my own work, I spent large amounts of time, years, in fact, with the three Italian movements, Communion Liberation, the Community of Sant'Egidio, and the group that will occupy our attention for the rest of this evening, the Focolare movement. Sociologically speaking, taking their standard from the norms established by the Second Vatican Council, these movements attempted to construct shared forms of religious life within a post-conciliar Catholicism that, for its own reasons, for Catholic reasons, sought to resist privatization and individual differentiation while accepting the normative separation of church and state. What this required, in other words, was that each movement had to develop its own way to generate integrated persons, to resist the imposition of differentiation. How did they do it? Well, it took me a long time to understand. But what they developed, I think, are unique versions of thick practices, that kinds of practices that are capable of resisting differentiation and disintegration, the kinds that are so normal for us as secular moderns, while still lauding and valuing the kind of political differentiation that a modern public religion calls for. Each movement does this very differently. And to understand how they do it, I had to immerse myself in their life world, in their practices, in their way of talking, in their friendships. I had to be taught their way of living and looking at the world so that I could not only perform their thick practice myself, but also feel in my own body the kinds of things they talk about feeling when they do the practice. This is part of what happens in this kind of qualitative sociology of religion. What are thick practices, though? We have to understand something of that in order to be able to understand what was happening. And how can they help us understand this whole democratic problem? Following the work of Jamie Smith, who I said before, thick practices can be helpfully understood in contradistinction, to thin practices. In a very important, and in my opinion, much under-recognized essay entitled Secular Liturgies, Smith argues that thin practices are just the normal, seemingly neutral activities that occupy us in our daily lives. Driving, answering emails, coming to a lecture at Loyola Chicago. Thick practices, on the other hand, are identity forming. They mark out those who practice them as that kind of person, those kinds of people, and they inculcate in those kinds of people normative visions of the good life. Thick practices, in other words, are the spool around which the threads of the thin practices in our life get rewoven. Smith's argument is that over time, the repeated practice of these thick practices reorganizes and reorients and resensitizes the many thin practices of which our daily life is composed, trumping in the process other rivalrous thick practices that beget rivalrous ways of living and offer competing visions of the good. What I came to see was that each movement had developed characteristic thick practices that they prized highly, taught to one another, wrote about, and spoke about, and lived and loved. And all because their practicing of their thick practice allowed them to become the kind of person they wanted to be. Each movement wants to be a different kind of person. The Focolare wants to be united with others. The member of Sant'Egidio wants to be friends with the abject. Friends, right? A member of Communion Liberation in their own way. Importantly, there are many kinds of thick practices, and these are different ones. And one of the things that we can notice about our own differentiated world is how many of the thickest practices in which all of us here are engaged right now have come untethered in any way from religious institutions. One of the things we can see, in fact, about the product of white Christian nationalism is that the recent religious data shows that attendance at belonging and attendance at religious practices is declining everywhere across the board in America, except for in evangelicals. Except when you look closer, you see that there's a slight increase in the number of evangelicals, but the number of increase in those who call themselves evangelicals does not correspond to any increase in practice. Dissociation of a thick practice and an identity claim is what's happening here. So this challenge that we are living in, these rivalrous thick practices, this is the challenge of our secular age. It's an age in which the thread has come unspooled, and what a thick practice does is rebundle what has been unbundled. Maybe to use a more biblical idiom at a Catholic studies talk, it gathers what has been scattered. It not only gathers, but it articulates the way that the gathering should be done. And that way is unique again. And these secular liturgies, those that are scattered all around us, they're not just religious, they're also secular now. They're associated with many things. You know them. Semper Fi. This is my thick practice. I'm a Marine. Ball is life. Right? Make America great again. This is, in fact, what my students and I in our sociology of spirituality class, some of you who were here, we've been studying just this, these rivalrous spiritualities that happen to us over the course in the secular age. We've been studying these spiritualities as tools with particular strengths and particular weaknesses. It's not that religion equals good or secular equals bad. It is not the case. They have particular kinds of strengths, and we have to examine them. Marvel movies, Burning Man, mysticism, politics as religion, technology forms, all of these things, rivalristic practices. But returning to the point at hand, for members of each of these movements, it is the ongoing practice of their thick practice that allows them to resist the other practices and to return to the movement's ideals, to be a true Focolare member, a real burner at Burning Man, a die-hard Trumper. And this means that paying close attention to thick practices can allow us to pay also attention to who this person becomes as they practice the practice. What kind of subjectivity do you take on? How is it induced in you? And we can analyze through this the possibility of becoming subjects of public religion in a variety of ways. Methodologically, then, this allows religious subjects and institutions to be evaluated for what they are rather than what they aren't, for the capacities they want to have rather than those they are failing to have. It allows us to avoid the presumptive question that's so often present in the social sciences, questions that rhyme with, why are these people failing to become secular? And instead ask, who do you want to become? Understanding and immersing myself in these thick practices, let me understand not just the way that they feel and move and live in the world then, but the kind of public intervention, the powers of publicity that they come to possess by being such a self. And let me see, how could they make an intervention in our world that might respond to these kinds of challenges? And this is why, if you will forgive the wordplay, I'm arguing tonight that it is not possible to understand the subject of public religion without understanding the subject of public religion. So who are the Focolare? The Focolare movement takes its name from the Italian word for hearth, fireplace, the place a family gathers. The movement was founded in Trent in 1944 by the Italian laywoman Chiara Lubick and, I kid you not, 12 of her female friends. When they began to hide from the bombings of the Allies in Trent, by taking in the caves around the city and took with them a book of the Christian Gospels with them. It was while reading a passage from the Gospel of John in the dark of one such cave, a passage in which Jesus asks his Father to unite the human race, make them one, that Lubitsch sensed inside of herself a desire to help bring about such a unity in the world. Over time, she and her companions came to believe that it was the pursuit of unity to which they were being called to dedicate themselves. In the early years of this movement, then, these young women attempted to bring about unity on the local level. They would go around Trent during the war and serve people. Their families all fled the city, and they stayed and lived in an old rectory in the downtown area. They wanted to make this unity stretch out over the city and amongst their community, but not just over the city then, over all kinds of divisions, all over the globe. From these tiny beginnings, the Focolare movement spread really rapidly after the war. The 1950s saw them expand all throughout Italy and then into other European countries. The members of the movement came to the United States in 1961. They were in Africa in 63. They were in Asia in 1966. And this geographical spread was made possible, you'll not be surprised to hear, by their movement's rapid numerical growth as well. For example, although the movement has grown smaller in recent years, it has. In 2021, it still counted over 140,000 officially enrolled members. And this does not count, they're in 180 countries. And this does not count those who are just like tacitly affiliated, those who come to a meeting or another. If you count those who do that, the church officially counts a lower number of 2 million affiliated people. And the Focolare say themselves that there are probably some 5 million people associated with this. Not a small number. The movement's work in all of these places that it's entered in all of these countries is stamped by that same charism of unity, its capacity to enter into dialogue with those very different from themselves. For the Focolare, this entails all kinds of public projects, businesses, publishing houses, a variety of international NGOs, and forming their own membership and the practice of realizing unity. It's the cultivation of this personal capacity for unity at which the thick practice that typifies the Focolare movement aims. As their founder, Kiara Lubitsch, put it, unity is the word that sums up the life of our movement. And the practice they deploy to enact this unity, they call embracing Jesus forsaken. It's a little dramatic, real. Let me tell you a story about the practice. Mariana, she's a very impressive woman. In her mid-30s with olive skin and straight black hair. She's South American by origin and a lawyer by training. At the time of our interview, she worked as a director of an institute for law and religion at a major research university on the East Coast. When I asked her how one goes about embracing Jesus forsaken, practicing the practice, she paused in our conversation. She looked at me very seriously for a moment. I try to be totally present to the person who's in front of me, she said. I try in each moment to rediscover the Jesus who is in each one of us. As she spoke, my phone was sitting on the bare boardroom table that lay before us. And I remember us glancing down at it from time to time, double and triple checking that the recording software was still functioning. Like, this is my dissertation, I can't lose this, As I listened, though, I was trying to parse the meaning of her words and to prepare the next question, and I'm looking around the room. But unlike mine, her attention was completely undivided. It was as like there was nothing for her to even ignore. She was, if not perfectly, then at least a lot more so than her interlocutor, totally present to the person before her. To be the object of such attention, the recipient in our age of distraction, uncomfortable, strange. It was unnerving and a relief at the same time. Like, you're paying attention to me. So I asked another question, right? You have to avoid the tension. How do you do it? How do you do this? She says, this is the practice. Empty yourself. Listen. Be in this attitude of gift of yourself to the other. And that will generate the openness that the other will feel. And that will generate unity. Have you done this recently? I ask her, hoping that a story will help clarify what she's talking about. She's like, sure, yesterday. Like, oh my God, thank you. Yes, tell me about this. Yesterday, she says, I had this lunch. It was awkward in a sense. I know that her center works as often organizes small workshops and large conferences are dealing with law and religion. And I'm already imagining what could account for all this awkwardness. She says, I was having lunch with 2 Orthodox rabbis. She continues, one of them my colleague here, but another I hadn't met before. And his wife joined us. So there are 4 of us at the table. And obviously, she's very normal as she says this. Obviously, the other rabbi, he's sitting right in front of me, but he would not look at me. And she looks quite calmly across the table at me, right as she says that. Because I am a woman. I say nothing. We're sitting across from each other, she continues, but he was speaking diagonally. And she traces a line that runs from my eyes over her shoulders. My own shoulders are tense by this time. She's describing the details of their conversation, how she listened as the other three spoke and she did not, about the struggles that arise in civil law in the United States and that of Orthodox Judaism, and how the discussion about whether her center might be a good host for a public event on these kinds of things could be made possible. And as she's speaking, I'm careful to look nowhere but into her eyes. But you know, she says, sighing, he was speaking diagonally out of respect for me. I'm sitting there and I'm trying, obviously, I can't speak much because I'm the Catholic at the table. I don't have that much to contribute to their conversation, but I can be this presence that is silent. And my silence might give them the light that they need to develop whatever they need to develop. It's very interesting because it was a challenge for me. For example, there was a point at the discussion where they're using these very technical Hebrew terms. And my colleague's wife turns to me and she says, do you understand what this term means? And I didn't, and so she explained it. And just then, when his wife was explaining it, my colleague looked over at me. And I could see that he was very pleased. I felt that he was pleased. He was comfortable there at the lunch table. It had taken us a long time to get to that point. At first, he was so suspicious of me, so suspicious. So on one hand, when I was going to that lunch, I was concerned because I had no idea how to contribute in this closed environment. But on the other hand, I told myself, I have to do nothing but love them. That will be my contribution. Maybe I won't say anything. Maybe I'll stay quiet the whole lunch, but that will be my contribution. And when I saw his face, pleased with these moments, she paused right then again, remembering his face. This look of satisfaction was on her own face. I thought, yes, we managed. That was what was needed. That was it. I don't need anything more than that. So I look away from her eyes then for a moment, trying to take all this in. I'm totally overwhelmed. And I'm readying myself to ask another question. Then taking a breath, I tell her, I'm very grateful for your story. Can I ask you another question? Yes, she says. I know you're well aware that most people would interpret that experience you went through very differently than you are. They wouldn't notice what you noticed, but they would notice the fact that you, an immigrant, a woman of color, are silent, literally being overlooked. Lots of people might see this as an injustice rather than progress and dialogue. Did you feel that? The pain of not being recognized, of being dismissed? Because it seems to me it would be just for you to be recognized and taken seriously and engaged and at least looked in the eyes. Is that a fair read? In my recording of our conversation, the conference room is quiet for a moment as Mariana considers her response. And then her voice reemerges. That would be a fair read, she says, her words humming with the measured pace of her accented speech, if I had given any thought to it at all. And then she laughed. I'll forego, you're welcome, a full explanation of everything that is contained in that answer. But the concise description of what is happening there, of what she says, gives me a chance just to say what this practice is and who she has become, trying to come to a conclusion. There are 5 steps of the practice. I will mention them and then pay attention to one quickly. The first step of the practice then is noticing, taking note of an experience of suffering or of disunity or of pain as it impinges upon them. Once that kind of experience of disunity is noted, the second step involves not distancing oneself from it, but embracing it. Rather than withdrawing, that is, the focolari seek to remain, to draw closer or embrace suffering. Through a repetition, then, a practitioner learns, the third step, to recognize Jesus who is present in this experience of suffering or of disunity or another kind of pain. Fourth, it is this recognition that enables movement members as they put it, call that Jesus present under this kind of suffering by name. So they will say things like, Jesus abandoned, right? Jesus lonely, Jesus overlooked. So in that moment, she was looking at this man and she says, oh, there you are, Jesus, who is overlooking, who has also been overlooked. What that means then is that this establishes a relationship with their own deity, who was also lonely, confused, shamed, forsaken in this given experience that they are having right then at the moment, this suffering. It's that relation then that allows them to embrace suffering and not only embrace it, to experience suffering as attractive. I'm not exaggerating. Like, this is the way they understand themselves in the world. They experience these moments of suffering as potential sites of a pre-existing, consoling, relational bond with the one that they call God. And that allows them to remain right there in that place of suffering instead of running away. When practiced together, then, what these 5 steps empower is the capacity to embrace an experience of disunity, because it's experienced as always already having been a place of unity. He's always already there. But it's mastery of the second step of the practice that's most essential tonight for our purpose of understanding the focolare as subjects of public religion. And it's because there in the second step, focolare learn how not to withdraw from moments of suffering. In practice, this means that when they're presented with disunities, at the very moment they are slighted or brushed aside or overlooked, a focolare virtuoso strives to become empty, to listen, remain, embrace, draw closer. And this requires learning how to set aside their own feelings and ideas to welcome those of another. They talk about experiencing pain. It's not that they don't understand that. Like, they will have this, and then they will say, but no, I remain there. This I learned over time is what movement members like Mariana meant when they spoke about emptying themselves or adopting an attitude of gift of themselves to each other. It's this step of the practice of embracing Jesus forsaken that involves opening, remaining, giving at the site of suffering. In moments of tension or blockage or pain, they seek to create within themselves, to become themselves, a space of encounter, by not retreating from disunity, but embracing it and embracing the person who may have caused it. It's a little insane. Focolare then as subjects of public religion. It's only now, after all of this preceding, that we can finally ask who it is that focolare members become in the practice of practicing such a practice. Thank you, that was a good one. I've been working on that. What does this practice resist? How does it reintegrate the differentiated? Remaining focused on just this second step of the practice and turning once more to Charles Taylor, we can see that becoming the kind of person who is able to embrace Jesus forsaken means resisting what he calls a buffered self, the kind of self that we differentiated secular moderns are induced to take on, and learning how to become porous, a porous self, buffered and porous. But what do these two terms mean? We begin with the former, buffered self. Even though the wording might sound strange to us, all of you seated here, all of you watching online, you know what a buffered self is, or at least you know what it can do. The buffered self is our normal way of dealing with most types of suffering, with most unpleasant things, for example. After all, what do we do? What is our strategy for getting to safety when things might hurt us? We put up the buffer to keep them away. We refuse to allow all that out there to get in here to us. Taylor says this kind of buffered self is one for which, quote, the possibility always exists of taking a distance from, disengaging from everything outside my mind. In response to a given instance of suffering, in other words, a buffered self withdraws, raises its inner Maginot line between itself and that which might hurt it. And it's that capacity to become buffered that allows us, to Taylor says, to see ourselves as invulnerable, as master of the meaning of things for it. All of these, then, are ways in the face of suffering of raising up the moral blast shield so that, as the famous British band The Who sang, we don't get fooled again. It means that the buffered self is the one we've grown accustomed to being, to living as. We've grown accustomed to, as Casanova said, being the temple of modern polytheism, the mind of our individual self. If Mariana had erected a buffered instead of a porous self, she could have dismissed the overlooking caused by the rabbi by leaving the room, or challenging him, labeling him a misogynist, or confronting him, or simply by saying to herself, I'm never going to put myself in that situation again. But it's not what she did. The porous self. By contrast, a porous self neither aspires to, nor is universally capable of, mastery through disengagement. Instead of being stamped by an ambition to invulnerability, to a quote unquote natural capacity to withdraw from threats, a porous self seeks immersion, not disengagement, but engagement. This choice to engage, to immerse oneself, means that a porous self is more vulnerable than a buffered self. It can be affected by the sufferings of the world precisely because its interior is not fully protected from the exterior world. For a buffered self, the protective or the healing tactic then is deployment of the buffer. Such a self, quite rationally, takes a distance from threatening phenomena. But a porous self takes another path. It is possible for such a self to cultivate a different kind of relationship with pain. The focolari do just this. It's this metamorphosis of the self from buffered to porous, from disengaged to engaged, that the thick practice of embracing Jesus forsaken empowers in them. And this then transforms suffering. Suffering for the focolari is no longer an experience that demands protection, withdrawal, erection of the boundary. Instead, it's the signifier, the marker of the possibility of starting a new relationship between one porous self and another. The wager that the practice of Jesus forsaken makes is that by walking the pilgrim road from buffered to porous, the other will perhaps, of their own accord, be also transformed likewise, from competitor to colleague, from rival to friend. This is the light in which Mariana's opening statement on Jesus forsaken should be read. This is the practice, she told me. Empty yourself, listening. Be in this attitude of gift of yourself to the other. That will generate the openness that the other will feel. That will generate unity. We can see this not only in her words, but also in the words of the founder of the movement, Chiara Lubich. She wrote that for the focolare, we are ourselves not when I close myself off from the other, but rather when I give myself. When out of love I lose myself in the other. My subjectivity is. When out of love, it is completely transferred into the other. To be a focolare is to be a person who can realize unity by transforming suffering, the very thing that divides, into a place of relationship. The moment of severing is a moment of bonding. Public. As in private and in the practice personally, so there in the public sphere. What the focolare movement learns to do, who they learn to be, in fact, is that in practicing the embrace of Jesus forsaken, the same set of skills can be deployed anywhere. There are many examples of this. I list them very briefly. They have a group called New Humanity for a United World, which is an NGO founded in 1988, that is now a general consultor to the United Nations Economic and Social Council. They try to bring this practice there to the UN. They have an Economy of Communion project, which is a worldwide consortium of 900 businesses, each of which dedicated to showing it is possible to practice business through this method. In fact, it is the Economy of Communion that's sponsoring the current Economy of Francesco project that some of you may have heard about, Pope Francis's economic project, the one he's trying to build that he hopes can produce a different kind of economy that brings not life, but death. Not life and not death. I'm sorry, Francis. One that is inclusive and not exclusive, humane and not dehumanizing. And each of these differentiated spheres of modernity then, politics, business, the arts, the wager is the same. Become porous at the sight of suffering. Transform the nature of the encounter. So what we can see here is that in these moments, in each of these spaces, their task is with respect to the differentiation. They do not try to collapse and pass laws that are going to resuture the spheres, but instead enter it, and where a public sphere might be lacking, a space for debate and argument and agonic conflict. And those spaces are often places full of suffering. Instead of doing the kind of thing that we ourselves have been, I myself have been quite rationally taught to do, go away, right? I'm going to block that person. Instead, that place of pain becomes the side of the public sphere. And it can be a beginning again. It can be a beginning again. So I end with this here as a response to de-democratization. I have sought to show each of you that those seeking to respond to the crisis of de-democratization may find aid in a surprising source, not just the subject of public religion, but the subjects. As I have made it here, however, such a statement is not universalizable. It's an invitation to particularity because each of these things are different. Each thick practice produces a different thing. Not every one makes the public possible. This one does. Instead, this argument has required, I apologize, us taking the long route through fine-grained analyses of these particular thick practices as these subjectivate particular types of religious persons. And what it has revealed is the presence of modern persons who, like the Focolare, are capable of deprivatizing without seeking to dominate or reintegrate the differentiated spheres of modernity. Further, I've tried to argue that this type of public religious subject is uniquely capable of contributing to democratic renovations, not in spite, but precisely because of the capacities they bear as religious subjects. Because of these thick practices, they can do these things. What does this mean? Here, we have to ask ourselves, I have to pose to you a hard question about the state of our democracy. Who are you willing to become? Are you willing to let go of some of the differentiations to which you have grown accustomed in order to consider the possibility of responding to the crises that face us? What, when you were honest, is the thick practice that actually structures your life, your sense of self? What is the strategy used to deal with suffering? I invite you then to do an examen of your own thick practices tomorrow morning or this evening. And as our brothers and our sisters in AA or other 12-step groups would advise us, be rigorously honest in your self-assessment. Here is a clue to making this determination. Examine what you do with your leisure. A recent essay puts it this way. Leisure always represents an engagement with ends, the age-old sources of meaning in life. Ends are determined, your ends can be determined by the process of eliminating your means. If the reason you work is to support your family, your job is a means, your family an end. But ends can be truly valued only when you are unburdened by life's stresses or the compulsions within your own mind. How are you using your leisure? It will tell you much about what you are seeking and what your thick practice is. The archaic torso of Apollo. We cannot know his legendary head with eyes like ripening fruit. And yet his torso is still suffused with brilliance from inside like a lamp in which his gaze now turned to low gleams in all its power. Otherwise, the curved breast could not dazzle you so, nor could a smile run through the placid hips and thighs to that dark center where procreation flared. Otherwise, this stone would seem defaced beneath the translucent cascade of the shoulders and would not glisten like a wild beast's fur. Would not, from all the borders of itself, burst like a star. For here, there is no place that does not see you. You must change your life.
How to navigate from that microphone.
Yeah, that's nutritious, nourishing, and multidimensional. So thank you very much, Father Gilger. And we have roughly 11 minutes for some dialogue. So I would ask you to speak your mind, but be crisp about it. And we can get somewhere. So anybody have a thought? It is over there too. I heard, good, thank you, sir.
Hi, and thank you for the terrific talk. So I did have a question. As good as I think that the public sphere is, and I think all that you're talking about are great things that really make sense. I think that the public sphere allows sometimes for Catholics to engage in a discourse about the common good, no for instance about the environment, or about labor, or about any such things, which are obviously important. There's a way in which it doesn't allow Pope Francis to speak about the religious truths of our faith that do not go in tandem with modernity things. So how do you think Catholicism in general, or religion, can act in the public sphere, talking about the things that the public sphere does not like to hear about?
Can I grab that from you, Joao?
Yeah.
I think what you're naming, Joao, is really important. So the question for those online was about the actual openness of the public sphere, or the things that can be spoken about as long as they kind of are normatively agreed upon, and things that we can't be spoken about. So I think I want to say two things. One is I think the actual constraints on Catholic speaking in the public sphere are much exaggerated. I think mostly we get to say what we want. Now, it doesn't mean people have to listen, right? but the capacity to speak, and even speak from deeply within our own tradition, we are mostly free to do that. Now, that does not mean that the kinds of things that we may want to say are going to be agreed upon. But that's in fact the point of the public sphere. A really agonic public, like a fighting public, right? Where we can actually argue these things out. That's the kind of thing that I do think we want, but we want one where we can remain present to one another, that actually have the argument rather than segmenting ourselves into polarized tribes and labeling the others as irrational or hopeless or these kinds of things. So I would just say that I think it can be exaggerated. We can do it. It will require suffering on our part. We'll be unheard, and that's part of life. But the second thing is there are actual limits sometimes to what can be said in the public sphere and who can be seen. There's a lot of really important work that many of you will know has been done on the state of Muslims in Europe, and whether they can present themselves under their own terms of their own theological self-understanding. These are difficult questions that I don't have time to go into right now, but I actually do think it's possible. I think that those who critique the public as hopeless, including my friend Talal Assad, who is a great genius, I think he is too hopeless and too monolithic in understanding the problems. It's not terminal, I do not think.
Super question. Another one? Yes. Welcome. Thanks for a wonderful, marvelous lecture.
Thank you for all of your work that I cited in this piece.
So I'm gonna make you put your quant head hat on for a second, because it does. So here's my question. If de-democratization requires people who are formed by thick practices such that they become the kinds of people who are porous and therefore open to solidarity and so on, it does feel like then actual participation in practicing communities is crucial. So in that sense, as a sociologist, do you get nervous about numbers that tell us about decline of participation in religious observance, communities and so on? Does that make sense as a question? Okay.
Yes. Yeah, so the question is, for those online, the question is, am I nervous about the decline in participation given the need for ongoing participation in thick communities of practice to sustain the kind of democratic selves that would resist de-democratization? Yes, I get nervous about this, but there's an important caveat I want to make. So two things. One is that I think my own scholarship. So Mike, the point you read earlier, right? That scholarship can be, it's a missile activity. It can be a prayer. That's definitely what I think, right? Is, I can do scholarship in a publicly accessible secular mode, but this is a plea, like this is a begging, right? To make something possible, which I think, in fact, if we're honest for ourselves as scholars, that's what all scholarship is. Like, it's just a question of how many layers we're hiding it behind. So fine, point number one. Point number two is, I actually think that one of the things that this case shows us is that in the Focolares' own experience, they do not need everyone to become capable of embracing Jesus forsaken to realize the kind of public sphere that could allow conversation to happen. In fact, there are people who teach at some of these major universities who vowed members of the Focolare, who what they teach to their law students often is disciplinary practices that can allow them to do this in another idiom. Now, I do think that those things tend to wither away. The efficacy tends to wither away without being rooted in a thick community of practice. But even if that withering happens, what could be possible then for yourselves, to whatever thick practice you might be called to take on, and whatever public efficacy, that powers of publicity emerge from that, take it on and give that as a gift to the world. You do not need to have this one. You need to have one. I am a complete believer in, the expressive authenticity of the individual self. And I critique it all the time. And we are unique, immortal diamonds, as Hopkins would say.
Follow up, Dr. Smith? No.
I was just thinking that's why Taylor's probably writing a book on the mustard.
He's
Something about leavening effect.
It can begin. And I do think that people find it attractive. Like when I was sitting and working in each of these communities here, I find each of these communities immensely attractive. And I'm somebody who's already embedded in my everyday life in an entire other kind of thick practice. Like that's what Ignatian spirituality is when we do it well. It's a thick set of practices that allow us to intervene in the world in a characteristic fashion. So it's not the only one. Jesuits tend to make it the only one, but there are many and I loved them. And I was like, wow, maybe I could do that. No, I have this.
You're in the marketplace, so there's something coming at you. 1.5, 2 more. Anybody? Okay, sir, we'll come over here to you.
Thank you so much. I'm really intrigued by your choice to make an engaged stance toward the subjects of public religion that you chose to research. Could you comment on the advantages and limitations of taking that engaged stance?
A methodological question, right? So as a sociologist, what is the value of taking this kind of engaged stance towards the movements there? Yes, this is a difficult one that I've been working on I just gave a paper at the SSR a little while ago about why it's important to do the sociology of religion in this fashion. And what I use is, I leap off from Talal Assad's famous essay called Islam as Discursive Tradition. There he draws upon the work of Alistair MacIntyre on tradition, where MacIntyre says traditions are communities of ongoing argumentation about the good and how the good can be realized. And then Assad says that we should not study Islam as a religion, as in like a failed version of Christianity, but as its own discursive tradition that tries to make its own kinds of goods available for those who practice it. And there are different versions of Islam, as he would know very well, the same way there are different versions of Catholicism, as I'm trying to show in this. But that way of investigating the world is deeply related. I think we'll be benefited by Jamie's conception of thick practices there. And I would also say that there's been wonderful new work in affect theory and in feminist sociology about the necessity of engaging deeply with embodiment and sensation and affect. And so what you can see, what I'm doing in here is engaging with suffering as an affective stance in the world. It's not just a punctual event. It's like, what is the relationship that I cultivate with that thing? And how does it get remodeled? Because for many of us, this is part of the reason for the long, I'm sorry it was so long. The part of the reason for the long here is that it's very hard to see. If we just look at it like from the front, all we're going to see is like, these people are masochists. I mean, really, that's what we're going to end up thinking. And there are often they did not talk about this stuff because they knew how it would be received. They just were like, we don't know how to explain it to people. So I feel like that's one of the other engaged tasks of a sociologist, is to be an active translation, not just to the academy, which I very much want to do, but also to the church, which I think has misunderstood what this movement is. And it does have vulnerabilities. As I said, it's not like it's not a silver bullet, or it's not a vaccine for what we need. But and the members who do it can make themselves vulnerable in difficult ways. But it has effects.
Last one back there, thanks.
Thank you, Paddy, for your talk. Can you hear me well? Okay, thank you for your talk. One of the definitions that I have in mind about the public sphere is people paying attention to the same things. And that will be something kind of foundational when we think of conceptualize the public sphere. keeping that in mind, what do you think about the recent changes within the Catholic Church? Well, they're not necessarily recent, but all the pendulum that we see regarding different views. To which extent is it possible to develop that communion that is big view? Would develop?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Christian. Thank you. For those online, the question is, what do we see as a possibility within the Catholic Church today for developing these kinds of thick practices, given the rampant division within the church? Is there a possibility for sustained mutual attention to the same kinds of things? So I think it's an excellent question. And in some ways I'm very pessimistic, and in other ways I'm very optimistic. So the pessimism just looks at reality the same way I tried to begin the talk here. We look at different things, but we can look at the manipulation of our own attention by the technology forms that surround us, right? This is not just television now. This is the notification system and the scrolling apparatus that is like marketize myself and turn me into an algorithm. Like these kinds of things happening all the time. So I'm very pessimistic about our ability, like as individual willful creatures, to resist that kind of thing. Its job is to distract us. It is selling me attention, and what my job is to consume this information that it's doing. Like, I just hate that. But what I do want to say is that this does not mean it's hopeless. And in fact, the church is developing now responses to this kind of thing. In my opinion, what the Synod on Synodality, this ongoing meeting in Rome that Pope Francis is trying to conduct, does, what it actually is exactly what you're describing. It's a practice of learning how to sustain mutual attention on topics we do not agree on. That's the public sphere inside a rationality of the Catholic Church. It's amazing, right? So this is not a liberal public sphere because we're still a hierarchical institution, but that's happening there. And the capacity for sustained attention is amazing. So in my opinion, what would have been the worst thing to come out of the Synod on Synodality? In my opinion, the worst thing that could have come out is any tangible results immediately on the right or on the left, which is not because I don't want results, right? But it's because this is not what is happening here. What is happening here is that we have to learn a new thick practice of mutual attention in the light of the gospel in order to even allow us to be free enough to have any chance of answering from the Lord's perspective these kinds of difficult topics. Otherwise, we are just persons who are already inhabited by rivalrous identities that are not necessarily fully inflected by the 2,000-year tradition. We have to allow ourselves to be inhabited by the Spirit, which does not mean we will always agree, but it means we can sustain attention on the same thing. That's a church.
I have to hold on real quick because I forgot to say something in the intro, which was already long, but it's one line for the audience, just to think about this for you, Paddy, to close. The synodality thing's amazing. Everybody was there. It was a laboratory and listening for 30 days. A bunch of talkers sitting down being trained how to listen again. That's a pretty good thing. But here's a line for you, and it's from Dorothy Day, Renee Girard, and Eboo Patel. Three very different people, but they all say this: reality is more religious than rational. Does that fit with the subject of public religion? Final word, and then we'll give you a round of applause.
Yes, I mean, so the methodology that I'm learning from Jamie and from others is that we have to take on a post-secular stance, which does not mean anti-secular. What it means is paying attention to this enormous variety of thick practices that look like religions all around us here. All right, so we can see that. Semper Fi, ball is life, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. All right. Thank you very much.